State Police, Trooper Fry. State Police.
Yeah, there's somebody after me.
I'm sorry?
There's somebody after me.
Where are you?
There's somebody after me.
Okay, where are you?
There's somebody after me.
Where are you, ma'am?
I don't know.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we have an incredibly interesting story for you guys, but first I was talking to the like and the subscribe button and they're very sad that no one's asked them out for Valentine's Day yet. So please take the like button and the subscribe button out for a romantic candlelit dinner, and don't forget to tell them that you love them. They're really lonely this time of year. Also, just to remind you, we have a sub goal of 1,000 that I'm hoping we can hit by summer so that I can go explore the mysteries of the Bennington Triangle in person for all of you. If you haven't seen that video, I'll link it at the end of the video. But let's get to this story because it's really interesting. It's a long one, but today we'll talk about one of the biggest coincidences that I've ever seen in true crime that led to the discovery of a serial killer. And this serial killer could potentially still be active. You guys all know me and know that I love twists, and the amount of twists and turns in this story is absolutely insane. I do have a theory that I haven't heard on the internet yet, but it does require more of an in-depth investigation in order to bring it all together. This is the kind of story that when you think it's over, it just gets crazier and crazier. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and let's talk about the Long Island serial killer. Just a disclaimer, this story does involve discussions that are graphic in nature, so viewer discretion is advised for anybody under the age of 18. Shannan Gilbert had a rough upbringing, but she was described as friendly and always positive. She had tried many different jobs, such as being a hostess or working at a front desk at a hotel, but it was difficult for her to get by. So eventually, she became employed with an escort service. You see, the big draws to these escort companies was that someone could make 3 to 4 weeks worth of money in just one day. Shannan was drawn to the money. She does eventually encounter law enforcement during her employment with the escort service, and eventually the escort company shuts down. But Shannan wasn't ready to be finished with the income that it provided. That's when Shannan realized that she could make even more money if she cut out the escort service entirely and hire her own driver. She hopes that she could make enough money to pay for an education. She was already taking steps to better her life. In fact, she had signed up for classes at a local school. Well, on May 10th, Shannan calls her driver, Michael. She tells Michael that she's just finished a call with a client in Manhattan and that she needed to be picked up. Shortly after that, Shannan gets another call from a client named Joe. Now, Joe lives on Oak Beach in Long Island, and Oak Beach is about maybe an hour away from where Shannan was. So although it was a long drive, she was reportedly supposed to make $250 an hour with Joe, so the trip was worth it. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Shannan and Michael arrive at Oak Beach. Now, just a clarification, the normal procedure for Michael and Shannan when she had a call that was that far away, or actually any call in general, was for Michael to wait outside for her, or at least close to the location. You see, in addition to Michael being her driver, he was also her security. So from here, details tend to get a little bit murky, but here's what we know for certain. Shortly after they arrive, Joe and Shannan tell Michael that they're leaving to go on an errand. Now remember, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. They leave for 15 minutes and then return and go inside the house. Now, just to be open, it is assumed largely by the community that the two left to buy drugs, but that has never been confirmed by Joe. It does help explain some of the events that are about to occur, but anyway, it's never been officially confirmed that they left to buy drugs. So anyway, they go inside the house and they stay inside for about 2.5 more hours alone. After that 2.5 hours, Joe comes out to talk to Michael. He tells Michael that Shannan is freaking out and that she won't leave. He wanted her gone and he told Michael to get her out of his house. Apparently, Joe later told the Star Ledger that he didn't believe that Shannan was a female. He thought that she might have been transgender, and so he wanted her to leave. Either way, he told Michael that he wanted Shannan gone. He said that when he went to the bathroom, he came out after a few minutes and she was acting very erratically. Joe swears that over the 2.5 hours that they were alone, they never had sex and he never gave her any money. Michael doesn't immediately believe Joe, so he runs inside after Shannan. When Michael gets inside, Shannan is definitely acting strange. Joe tries to grab her and she gets even more upset. And now she's fully flipping out. And she runs and hides behind some furniture in his house and dials 911. While she's on the phone with dispatch, she keeps screaming, "They're trying to kill me." The call was placed at 4:51 in the morning. At this point, she's on the phone with police and screaming, so Joe just says, "You know what? I'm finished with this. I am going upstairs. Michael, get her out of my house." So Michael keeps trying to get Shannan to leave, but she's acting very strange and he doesn't understand why. She keeps screaming that now Michael is trying to kill her, and so finally Michael's like, "Alright, I'm just gonna go wait outside because obviously you're on the phone with the police. I'm gonna go outside and wait for the police to show up." You can hear her on the 911 call say, "Please get me out of here, Mike." Like she's acknowledging that he's there to help her. But then immediately she goes back to blaming him for plotting with Joe to kill her or something like that. Now, people suggest that this is a reason that they think it was the drugs that they allegedly had bought on their errand, and that Shannan was like having some kind of bad reaction to the drugs. Some other people suggest that maybe Joe said or did something that scared her, because in the 911 call she doesn't sound impaired. She sounds frightened and confused. And she thought that Michael was in on some kind of plan. That seems to be what she believes, because in the 911 call she can clearly be heard saying, "You're in on this," and Michael responding with, "I just met this guy." And then after that she says to the 911 operator, "They're trying to kill me, they're plotting to kill me." And then right after she says they're plotting to kill me, she starts asking Michael not to leave. And then she just flat out accuses Joe and Michael of plotting something against her. So there's this back and forth going on inside of Shannan's mind, and her emotions are running wild. She seems confused, and she's having some kind of extreme paranoia about the situation. Regardless, it's not clear exactly why Shannan was acting so strangely. So at this point, Michael has finally had enough. He knows police are on the way, so he goes outside. At this point, Shannan runs out of Joe's house and right past Michael sitting in his SUV, and right along Fairway Drive to knock on a neighbor's door for help. So she's pounding on this neighbor's door at 5 o'clock in the morning, and the man answers. Gus. He's an older gentleman, and when he saw that she was in trouble, Gus invited her inside his house. But he immediately saw the need for 911. So he also calls emergency services at 5:22 in the morning. At the point that he calls 911, Shannan decides that it's time to run again. Gus reported that she ran from his door, and as she ran down his driveway, a black SUV approached with her headlights on. This was later identified to be Michael in his car. Shannan saw this vehicle and immediately ran back into the driveway and hid behind Gus's boat. Gus reports that him and Michael had an exchange at this point, where Michael asked if he had seen Shannan, and Gus says that Michael told him they were having a party and she got upset and now she's running away from him. So obviously Gus was a little bit suspicious, because Shannan was just screaming that she was in danger and someone was after her, and then Michael shows up looking for her. So Gus told Michael that he had not seen Shannan. During this exchange, for some reason, Shannan decides to book it again. You can hear Gus on the 911 call say that she's headed to the main gate. It seems like he assumed that she's running out of the gated community. However, Shannan turns down another road, Bayou Way, and heads deeper into the gated community. The only exit out of the gated community is through the entrance she just ran right by. She then stops at another neighbor's house, Barbara. At this point, Barbara also calls 911 and reports that Shannan's at her house, but she says there's no way she's answering the door. At this point, Gus was waiting at the main gate for police because it's the only way in or out, and Michael had decided to leave before the police showed up. Let's give Michael the benefit of the doubt here. I'm sure he thought the police would take her to the hospital because clearly she needed to be taken care of. But he didn't want to be there for whatever reason. But that's not what happened. You see, when the police arrived for the call, they did a rudimentary search and talked to the neighbors that called police. After not being able to locate Shannan and due to Gus's 911 call about the black SUV, they assumed that that black SUV found Shannan, and eventually police left without being able to locate Shannan. They thought it was a domestic disturbance and that whoever was in the black SUV found Shannan, picked her up, and they left the gated community together. If you're anything like me, you can't believe that they would leave without locating the screaming girl. Especially since on the 911 call, Gus reported her to be around 14 years old. Why had they not made a bigger deal about a screaming 14-year-old girl being taken in a black SUV? Either way, we don't have a good answer for that question. But there are some details about the 911 calls that you should know. Well, if you'll remember that 911 call that Shannan placed from Joe's home at around 4:50 a.m., well, despite efforts by the operators, Shannan never really did tell them where she was. She had told them she was at a beach, and they had assumed she was on the wrong beach. You can hear the operators trying to figure out where she could be from, and for that reason, Gus and Barbara's calls on Oak Beach were not immediately connected to Shannan's calls where they believed were taking place on a separate beach. This led to the belief that Gus and Barbara's calls were not related to Shannan's call. Anyway, this was the last time that Shannan was seen alive. So let's fast forward. It's now been 2 days since Shannan's disappearance. So this incident happened on May 1st, and we are now on May 3rd in 2010. Shannan's mother, Mary, gets a phone call from a man named Dr. Peter Hackett. Dr. Hackett asks if Shannan is there with her or if she's still missing. Now, this is strange for many reasons, but the main thing is that Mary didn't even know her daughter was missing yet. Shannan didn't live with her mother, so it wasn't unusual to not hear from her for a couple days. So this Dr. Hackett was the first person to even tell Mary that her daughter was missing. Hackett tells her some interesting things here. Hackett tells her that he runs a home for wayward women and offers his medical services to the women. He tells Mary that Shannan had been with him the night before she went missing. He said that she knocked on his door and he let her in. He then said that he gave her some kind of drug to help her calm down, and then she left with her driver Michael and never returned. I know what you're all thinking. Who is Dr. Hackett? Well, remember the last neighbor on the bayou? The one that Shannan knocked at, Barbara? Well, Dr. Hackett lives right next door to Barbara. When I read this detail, I was like, okay, so Dr. Hackett saw Shannan earlier that night, and he lives right next door to where she was last seen. And beyond that, remember I said that her mother didn't even know Shannan was missing yet? More concerningly, how did Dr. Hackett even get Mary's phone number? Well, Mary asked him that very question while he was on the phone that night, and Dr. Hackett's response was that anyone he offers medical services to at his home must give him an emergency contact number, and Shannan had left Mary's number. Well, Mary swears that there was no way that Shannan would have given Dr. Hackett her number like that. She just says it's impossible. However strange, this phone call resulted in the fact that Shannan was reported missing by her mother. Now, the family finds out that it's true that Shannan was at Oak Beach that night, so they try to file the report with the New York City Police Department. However, since the crime took place in Long Island, and Shannan was from New Jersey, the case kept getting bounced around between the two jurisdictions. Eventually, the case stayed in New Jersey. Now, this further complicated the case because if you remember, Shannan called 911 but never actually said where she was from, and they hadn't been connected to Gus and Barbara's call yet. Well, now that the two cases aren't even being handled in the same state, this lengthened the time it took to make that connection. They do eventually make the connection, but we'll get there. You see, for whatever reason, Shannan's case didn't really get much attention. Not as much attention as it deserved. This could be because of the confusion about the jurisdiction, or it could be discrimination based on her profession. But for whatever reason, it seemed as though the police weren't taking her case seriously. Okay, so believe it or not, things get even more strange with Dr. Hackett. Because on May 9th in 2010, Mary was on Oak Beach neighborhood putting up missing persons poster for her daughter. Remember who lives down on Bayou Way? That's right, Dr. Hackett actually speaks with Mary and her family and says that it's the first time he's ever spoken to or met Mary. He claims that he never called her that night on the phone. He says that he doesn't have a wayward home for women and that Mary is making the whole thing up. Well, it turns out that Mary wasn't crazy, because later it was proven that someone did call Mary, but not from Dr. Hackett's phone. You see, the call was placed from Dr. Hackett's wife's phone. More concerning is that the geolocation revealed the call was placed from New Jersey, near Mary's house. How creepy stalkerish is that? Because remember, Dr. Hackett lives on Oak Beach, and New Jersey is in a whole different state. I thought that detail was incredibly creepy. But anyway, we never really get any further answers from Dr. Hackett. They both sort of stick to their stories, and it's never really resolved. I have seen reports that Dr. Hackett admitted to the calls, but I can't verify that anywhere. I can never see the quote where Dr. Hackett admitted to these phone calls. Mary says, Dr. Hackett called me that night, and that's how I found out my daughter was missing. Dr. Hackett says he never called and can't explain how or why the calls were made. Well, we do find out some more details about the doctor in Kolker's book about this case. You see, Dr. Hackett told several different stories about his interactions with Shannan on the night she disappeared. In one story, he claimed to have met her at his office and given her a sedative to calm her down, which we talked about earlier. But in another story, he had given her a ride to the hospital. He had also claimed that he called her an ambulance. None of these stories could be verified by witnesses or records. Additionally, Dr. Hackett was known to have made up embarrassing stories about any of the escorts who visited him for medical reasons. He would tell people that they had sexually transmitted diseases or mental health issues, and these were completely made up and fabricated stories. This caused some of the escorts to avoid him altogether and his services. Dr. Hackett's inconsistencies with his statements and his tendency to make up stories made him a suspect in Shannan's disappearance. The police searched his property and questioned him multiple times, but they were unable to find any evidence linking him to her disappearance. Dr. Hackett has denied any involvement in Shannan's case and passed a polygraph test. However, Dr. Hackett's actions and statements continue to be a subject of speculation to this day. After reading Kolker's book and researching the story, I believe that Dr. Hackett maybe had seen Shannan before, maybe even earlier on the night. But Hackett is a known liar. Furthermore, he exaggerates and has a desire to be at the center of attention, and the center of scandals. Remember, Shannan was seen screaming and knocking at Dr. Hackett's neighbor's door around 5 in the morning. It's not unreasonable to assume that he woke up or was already awake and heard the commotion and recognized Shannan. Or maybe he asked his neighbors and found out who Shannan was. After he realized that he knew her, he also realizes that he really did have her mother's information in his emergency contact list. In my mind, it's either that or Dr. Hackett had access to Shannan's cell phone after her disappearance, which would be pretty damning evidence. This is all just speculation on my part, call it reasonable doubt, but if the pieces fall together perfectly, Dr. Hackett could spin a tale and call her mother just to get himself involved with the story of a missing girl in his neighborhood, not actually having been connected to her disappearance. It just seems like something Dr. Hackett might try. Anyway, for some reason that we don't know, the police have cleared Dr. Hackett, they've cleared Joe, and they've cleared Michael of any wrongdoing in Shannan's disappearance. Okay, so we need to step away from Shannan's case for a minute. It's a horrible case, and it has so many questions left unanswered that we will answer some of as we tell the rest of the story. We could do an episode based on Shannan by herself, but Shannan is just one piece of a puzzle that's much larger. So let's continue, because we haven't even got to the serial killer yet. Before we get to the serial killer, I have to introduce you to Blue. Blue is a German Shepherd dog who is a police tracking dog. Blue's police handler took Blue to the Oak Beach area to search for Shannan in the fall. He definitely didn't expect to find her. After all, it had been so long that he doubted Blue could even get a trail. The officer admitted that this was more of a training exercise for Blue. So he goes out week after week, all the way into December. And he focuses on Ocean Parkway, because he has read somewhere that bodies are likely to be dumped within a very short distance of a main road. Oh, one more thing that I should probably clear up here is something that kind of confused me at first. You see, I live right near a beautiful New England beach. It's exactly what you'd expect from a beach. A lot of sand, dune grass, like plenty of open area. That's not what these beaches are at all. Think of a marsh area. Think thick, tall grass and bramble and thorns, really thick and hard to move through. That is Oak Beach. But on December 10th, Blue caught a scent and led the investigator into the thick bramble. And Blue is a good sniffing tracker boy because he led the officer only 30 feet from the road to a burlap sack that contained decomposing skeletal remains. So that's it, right? They finally found Shannan. Well, hold your horses, bucko, because further investigation shows that these remains, they're not Shannan's. You see, DNA proved that the remains are those of another escort named Melissa, who went missing in July of 2009. But like everything else in this case, things just get weirder. Because over the course of a couple days, after finding Melissa, 3 more bodies were discovered in the marsh. Each of the skeletal remains were wrapped in burlap and were laying not far from the other in a neat row. Further investigation showed that they were all young escorts whose names were Melissa, Megan, Maureen, and Amber. They each listed their services on Craigslist or Backpage just like Shannan. These girls will become known as the Gilgo Beach 4. On January 25th, 2011, the police announced publicly that they are searching for a serial killer. Police continue to try to comb the area for clues, but ultimately decide that the weather has become too bad and the snow too deep, so they suspended the physical search of the area until after winter. So while the physical search is on pause, the actual investigation kicks into high gear. The police begin investigating the girls who were found, and they figure the best place to start is with the known individuals and Shannan's disappearance. The assumption being that these girls must be related somehow. It's just too much of a coincidence that they're all the same age, the same ethnicity, the same background, and they use the same websites to advertise their services. So police go back to Joe's house. They interview him and they vet his story. All in all, they could not link Joe to any of the other girls, and they stamp a big red cleared tag on him. Next, they go to Michael. After a few interviews, they find nothing on Michael. No relations to any of the other girls, and he too is cleared. Finally, they go back to Dr. Hackett. Although there were many discrepancies in his stories, as we've mentioned, he somehow gets cleared as well. After clearing the obvious people, police have no other choice but to do a thorough investigation of each of the girls' lives. Who did they know? Who were their clients? This investigation was difficult. They could not link all 4 girls to any one single individual. And this was the primary difficulty in tracking down all of their clients. You see, Craigslist uses an encryption service that hides real email addresses. However, police thought it was important when they found a link to the girls from an individual who seemed to be hiding their IP address. Now this was 2010, so people with an average understanding of the internet didn't quite understand VPNs and how to hide someone's IP address. So it must be someone with at least an intermediate level of understanding about digital forensic evidence. It also should be noted here that police do believe these girls knew and trusted the individual. They shared the fact that some of the victims went to meet this man with no purse and no cell phone. This was a serious security concern for people in their profession. The idea here is that whoever it was probably knew them well enough to make them feel comfortable enough to leave their cell phone back at home. Each of the Gilgo 4 do have their own story, but this video is already going to be so long that maybe I can do another video later talking about each of their cases individually. But one detail in Rockler's book that I found very fascinating, it was a detail in Amber's case where she got an outcall for $1,500. This was way higher than normal and too much money to refuse. In fact, this was a reoccurring detail in a lot of the stories. They all received an offer that seemed too good to be true. Okay, so all police really have on this guy is that he has a way to make the girls not suspect him of being a violent serial killer. He has a way to get them to trust him. That's all they have. Well, that's not entirely true. Police do have a huge lead, but they're trying to keep it quiet. A lead that most definitely points to the real killer. A clue that's so disturbing, it is right out of a horror movie. Do you remember the first victim they found, Melissa? Well, the killer had been using Melissa's cell phone to call her little sister. He called her sister a few times, but this was before the murder investigations. Melissa hadn't been found yet. This was still when she was only reported as missing. You see, after Melissa was missing for some time, her little sister gets this phone call. The caller ID says that it was Melissa, and her sister had a moment of hope when she saw this. But when she answered the phone, it wasn't her sister on the other side. It was a man. Now, I'm not going to repeat some of the things that he says to her. They are horrible, and they're not appropriate for YouTube standards. But he does tell her some details about herself and about Melissa that a stranger could never know. Police were able to trace these phone calls, but the caller was quite digitally smart for someone in 2010. He kept his phone calls to only 90 seconds long, and when he did call, he would call from very popular areas like Times Square or Central Park. That way, even through tracing the cell phone pings, police could never get a solid lead on the individual. All the phone calls fit this general profile. All of them except for one. Now, just as a trigger warning, this detail is particularly dark, but in the last call the killer made, he told Melissa's sister that he had finally killed Melissa and that he was watching her body rot. When police traced this last call, it showed that the killer was at Gilgo Beach when he made it, right where Melissa's remains were later found. Unfortunately, this is a situation where the media is detrimental to the case because somehow the media caught wind of these phone calls. They decided to go public with the information. It's thought that once the killer knew he was being tracked to his burial area, he decided to never call again, and police lost the only solid lead they had to the real killer. After this, the investigation slows down until spring when they can continue the physical search again. Investigators go back out into the marsh to search for clues. On March 29th, 2011, investigators find a skull, hands, and a forearm in the marsh. These body parts were found near the Gilgo 4, but also about 3/4 of a mile away. Notably, these body parts were not wrapped in burlap, and they weren't in the same location or row as the other victims. Also, they were dismembered, whereas the other victims were found in a neat row, bodies intact and complete and wrapped in burlap. The profile of the condition of the bodies suggests that they are not related to the Gilgo 4, although some people suggest that they could be one killer's older burial grounds before he got better at his murderous deeds, and then he started burying them where he buried the Gilgo 4. We will get into that a little bit later, but personally, I doubt that these are the same individual. Okay, new bodies, new case, right? Well, police did link these body parts to a torso found in a city that is further inland named Manorville. After some investigation, they had a name for the body parts: Jessica. Jessica fit the profile of the other victims. She was an escort using Craigslist or Backpage to advertise her services. But the methods just seemed so much different. Police continued to search the area and actually located 3 more body parts: another skull, hands, and a foot. These parts were again linked to a different torso found in Manorville. This victim's identification remained a mystery until it was discovered in 2020 through genealogy. Valerie Mack. According to the official website, Valerie Mack, who was 24 years old when she went missing, with a last known address in Philadelphia, worked as an escort, using the alias Melissa Taylor. There is no family relationship between Mack and Jessica Taylor. Mack's family members provided additional DNA samples and confirmed that they last saw Mack in the spring and summer of 2000 in Port Republic in New Jersey. While she was not reported missing, this information aligned with the previous determination that Mac's remains were dumped in Manorville in 2000. Additionally, an interesting note is that these torsos were left in public places, almost like they were intended to be found. One was even inside of a public golf course. These patterns do not seem to fit the Gilgo 4. Anyway, let's get back to the marsh. Police continued combing the area for more clues or more remains. And a little further up the beach, near Oak Beach, police find 2 more bodies. One, a young Asian male who was believed to be deceased for at least 5 years. Police believe he was between the ages of 17 and 23 years old at the time of his death. The remains were found wearing women's clothing, and police believe that he was in the same profession as the Gilgo 4. The second body found was that of a baby girl, 1 to 3 years old. This victim would be linked through DNA to yet another victim that will be found that we haven't talked about yet. On April 11th, 2 more sets of remains were found on Jones Beach. The first was the bones and jewelry of a woman who was linked through DNA to the baby girl that we just talked about. It should be noted that the baby was found all the way on the other side of the island. Police also found the skull of another victim who was linked through DNA to a set of severed legs that washed ashore in 1996. So these bodies go back a long time. And now there's solid evidence to suggest that this area has been a dumping ground since at least 1996. So now we have a total of 10 victims and Shannan is still missing. I know it's a lot to keep track of, so here's an interactive map of the area where all the remains were found. I just wanted to give you all a little visual of all the beaches that we've been talking about. Here is Long Island, and as you can see, the long narrow stretch of land we're focusing on. You can see that Jones Beach is all the way on the left. That's where the body parts linked to the Manorville torso of Mac was found, as well as the skull of a woman whose severed legs were discovered in 1996. As we move down the beach to the right, we have Gilgo Beach, where they found the Gilgo 4. Further down Gilgo is where they found the unidentified Asian male, as well as the body parts of Jessica Taylor, the other of the torsos found in Manorville. Even further down, almost in Oak Beach, is where the baby was found. I'll link this map in the description if you guys want to follow along as we talk about it or explore the area yourselves. After all the bodies were discovered, there began to develop a divide between the prosecution and the police investigators, because they each had different theories about the case. The Suffolk County Police Commissioner at the time, Richard Dormer, thought that it was the work of one man, and that Shannan's disappearance was completely unrelated to the remains found. The district attorney said that it was the work of 2 separate killers. This caused confusion in the case. I can understand both arguments. What are the odds that there are 2 serial killers using the same dumping grounds at the same time? Also, there are clearly 2 separate patterns at play here. It does seem like 2 different killers are at work. One who's an organized trophy killer, arranging his victims in a nice neat row, concealing their bodies so that only he knows where they are. He's in control. He even calls the families of his victims to brag. He likely gains pleasure by causing fear to people. The other profile seems to be one of someone who meticulously dismembers his victims and spreads the remains across a large area. This suggests more of a rage-filled killing. He purposely left his victims' torsos in places where they'd be found, while keeping parts of the victims as trophies. It seems that he prefers the shock and awe. He likes causing chaos. Think about it for a second. 2 very different killers and 2 very different motives. Same dumping area? Something just seems too coincidental. Additionally, in my opinion, it seems like the victims were from different eras. Some of the victims go all the way back to the 90s, while the Gilgo 4 are all from 2007 to 2010. And speaking of the Gilgo 4, let's go back to the victims for a second. The first victim, Maureen, was reported missing on July 6th, 2007. And again, she was the first chronologically of the Gilgo 4 victims. Now, the killer takes a break here for 2 years and 6 days before the second victim is found. Her name was Melissa, and she was reported missing on July 12th, 2009. July 6th, 2007 was the first victim. July 12th, 2009 was the second victim. That's almost exactly 2 years to the day. The third victim was only 10 months later. Megan on June 6th, 2010. And then 3 months after Megan, Amber was reported missing, September 2nd, 2010. Notably, 2 of the girls were murdered in 2010. And the killer even called the last victim's family. He was getting more brave as he piled on more victims. This doesn't seem like someone who's been killing since the 90s. It seems like someone who just started killing in 2007. And it probably scared him. I imagine he was panicking after this and for 2 whole years was just waiting for police to come knocking. That's why he took 2 years and 6 days off. But the police never came knocking. I can imagine that on the anniversary 2 years after the first murder, he decided that he wanted to kill again, and that those 6 extra days were probably spent finding his next victim. After he took his second victim in 2009, he probably started to get a little bit more brave. And then, less than a year later in 2010, he murdered his third victim. Now, he probably felt invincible at this point. The police could never catch him. He was smart, he was meticulous, and he felt like he was always one step ahead of police, as suggested by the phone calls to the sister from public places. He was confident. And he cut ties with the cell phone as soon as he felt like his cover was blown or that he was compromised in some way. Now let's look back at the victims who were dismembered. These victims fit an entirely different profile, a torso killer. And guess what? There have been other torso murders in the area of New York City. A man nicknamed the Torso Killer, or the Times Square Killer, Richard Cottingham. Cottingham is an interesting link because he's been behind bars since 1980, serving multiple life sentences. But these other victims fit the pattern for Cottingham. In fact, I even found reports that talk about how Cottingham was extremely forensically aware in an era way before DNA forensics. He was also smart about leaving behind any traces of evidence at all, physical or otherwise. This sounds eerily like the killer calling from Times Square and using the VPN before a VPN was common knowledge. This shows an element of forensic awareness, even on a digital level, before we knew as much as we do now. So yes, it's my belief that there is more than one killer at work here. Okay, so looking at the case through that lens, how can we link these killers together? Because we need to explain the similarities between the two cases, specifically why they use the same dumping grounds. There are other details and links between these two killers that we have to explain in some way. The girls are all the same profession, the same age, the same ethnicity, same dumping grounds. Maybe you could explain the two very different killers by saying that they knew each other. In fact, maybe they knew each other really well. Maybe they grew up together. Maybe it's an older and a younger brother. Maybe they're cousins, a father and a son, maybe. This is further evidenced by the fact that it seems like there's 2 different eras of murders taking place here. Furthermore, both sets of victims have their own similarities to Cottingham's victims. The Gilgo 4 killer was forensically aware, arguably ahead of his time in that respect, just like Cottingham in the 60s. The other victims were mutilated in a way that fits right along with Cottingham's patterns, brutal and senseless, such as leaving the bodies in places that they're intended to be found. Perhaps the 2 killers grew up fascinated with Cottingham. Perhaps they even knew him. Maybe they knew him well enough to learn tips and tricks from him, or perhaps they just studied him in detail growing up. Either way, it suggests that the 2 killers knew each other growing up. I just thought this was a good time to point out my theory about the 1 killer or 2 killers, so let's just get back to the story. Remember, Shannan is still missing at this point, and her family is trying to push for her to be found through all this chaos. Police finally get the go-ahead to drain the large marsh area near Dr. Hackett's house where Shannan was last seen, and in early December 2011, Suffolk County Police found Shannan Gilbert's purse and mobile phone in that Oak Beach marshland that they drained. They also reportedly found her jeans, which police believe were removed by Shannan herself. 2 days later, a quarter-mile east of her belongings, Shannan's remains were located. She was found laying face up, and she wasn't wrapped in anything. Police say she didn't seem to have any injuries at all. Law enforcement's theory, as far as I can tell, is that Shannan's mental state, as evidenced by her 911 call, in combination with drugs and alcohol, led her to have an episode that night which caused her to run into the marshland, afraid that someone was chasing her. After running into the marsh, they believe that she succumbed to hypothermia and later drowned in the water. This explains why she would have removed her own clothes. For those of you who don't know, a common reaction to hypothermia is to remove your own clothes. It's called paradoxal undressing, and it happens because you lose rationality in your mind and your nerves become damaged. This makes you feel incredibly hot, so a victim of hypothermia tend to strip off their clothes. The coroner ruled her death accidental, but the family disagrees with these results. They cite a missing hyoid bone in Shannan's neck, which is common among those who are strangled to have this fragile bone broken. However, remember, Shannan was laying in those 8 inches of salt water since May of 2010, so it's hard to definitively conclude anything based on the missing hyoid bone. The consensus is that Shannan's death was unrelated to the rest of the bodies found in the area. It's accepted that it was just the most bizarre coincidence that has ever led to the discovery of a serial killer ever. I'd again like to stress that the family does not agree with these findings. They hired the New York City medical examiner to do a second autopsy, and he concluded that there was no way to decide a cause of death. But he did note that the findings were consistent with strangulation. The family cites this and accuses Dr. Hackett of being responsible for Shannan's death. You thought the twists were all done, but I've got one more twist in this big bag of crime-flavored pretzels because, believe it or not, it gets even weirder. In 2015, the FBI finally gets involved. But the district attorney and the police department keep the federal investigators at a distance because of some serious police corruption in the department. You see, Chief of Police James Burke had a history of drinking and driving, he had a history of drugs, and he had a history with a lot of the sex workers in the area, which has led to some speculation of James Burke being a suspect as the Long Island serial killer. After all, that would help explain how the killer knew to get away with calling the family and hiding his IP address. In 2016, James Burke was sentenced to 46 months in federal prison after pleading guilty to depriving a person of civil rights and conspiracy to commit obstruction of justice in connection with a case where a man broke into Burke's police vehicle and stole his duffel bag. When he was taken into custody, he was tied to the floor and violently beaten by Burke. The alleged contents of this duffel bag are very interesting, revealing even. I don't know, but either way, the contents are something that I cannot mention here on YouTube. Maybe if you catch me in a live stream and you ask, I'll let you know what I've dug up on this guy Burke and what was in the duffel bag. Either way, Burke is a character, and I could see him involved with the violence needed for these killings. That's my opinion, of course, anyway. This same year, 2016, an escort came forward to bring allegations against Burke. She claimed that in 2011, she partied with Burke at an unknown home in Oak Beach, where they engaged in, quote, rough sex. And she said that there were drugs, and she said she saw Burke use cocaine on a few occasions. Now, these claims are important because it puts Burke in the area where L.I.S.K is known to be active. To be clear, James Burke has never been charged or even named as a person of interest in this case, and everything I've found seems to be circumstantial, admittedly with some interesting witness testimony that may put him in the area of L.I.S.K stomping grounds. But again, James has never been fully named. Other suspects have been floated around and officially announced, as with John Bitchrolf. Bitchrolf was convicted in the beating deaths of 2 women, and in 2017, Suffolk County Assistant District Attorney Robert Biancavilla said the deaths of several victims found along the Gilgo Beach may have been attributed to the handiwork of Mr. Bitchrolf. The prosecutor did not elaborate, however, and it is important to note that no known evidence has ever been linked to Bitchrolf. There are some interesting details about Bitchrolf. Bitchrolf lived just a few miles away from where the torsos were discovered, and even stranger, his daughter grew up to be Melissa's best friend. If you'll remember, Melissa was one of the Gilgo 4 whose sister was called after her disappearance. Police always wondered how the killer knew so much about Melissa and her family. Well, this could explain that. Police have not listed Bitchrolf as an official suspect regardless of the DA's statements. Another man suspected of the crimes is James Bissett. He owned a plant nursery in Long Island, which gave him access to the same type of burlap used to wrap the victims' bodies. Speculation grew when Bissett took his own life just days after Shannan's remains were found. The only other name that I found thrown around is Neil Falls. You may have heard of this guy. He was a rare case in where a killer got what he was coming to them. Instant karma. You see, in 2015, Falls was in West Virginia when he went to the home of a sex worker named Heather. He pulled a gun on her, and Heather fought back. She wrestled the gun from Falls and shot him in the head, and he died on the scene. When police arrived, they find what can only be described as a serial killer's toolbox in his trunk, from restraints to shovels and even trash bags and bleach. Neil Falls is a person of interest in missing or murdered escorts across 8 different states. Although it seems like it could be one of these suspects, police have interviewed almost all of them, except for Neil Falls, and they are saying that they don't believe they have a suspect. We saw this with the Idaho case. There's so much evidence pointing to food truck guy and neighbor person and this person and that person, but police kept saying we've cleared them. It just goes to show that sometimes we need to trust what law enforcement is saying about these cases. I admit they do drop the ball, more often than what we would hope, but sometimes it's the things that we don't know in a case that make them so certain about their suspects. On December 7th and 8th, 2020, new images of evidence is released. They are images of a belt believed to be handled by the killer. You can see the unique lettering on the belt. The letters HM or WH are embossed in the leather. It's believed that the belt was handled by the perpetrator and did not belong to any of the victims. In April 2022, investigators released surveillance footage of Megan Waterman in a hotel lobby. There is quite a bit of footage here. Also, they released the 911 call made by Shannan, which was a piece of evidence that the true crime community had been asking for a long time. These different pieces of evidence are long, and we will watch them in their entirety, maybe in a live stream or in a separate video, because this video is already so long. And that takes us right to the end. Let me know what you think in the comments. Is there one killer? Is there 2 killers? Could they be related? What about Richard Cottingham? For those of you who got this far, thank you so much for sticking around. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. I've been floating some ideas about some merch, and I was thinking about maybe starting with some t-shirts. I could use these t-shirts as rewards and giveaways for achievements and goals that I set for the channel. So please like and subscribe, and you could win some type of merchandise in the future. So thank you all for sticking around, and as always, please stay safe.